There's a kind of silence in Alexandria that only comes after midnight. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like the city itself is holding its breath, waiting. That was the silence that surrounded Salma the night she bought the ink. They say art comes from the soul, but what if something else is willing to write through you? Salma loved calligraphy, not as a job, not as a hobby, but as a form of pure devotion. She held the belief that writing sacred verses or ancient Arabic poetry by hand was a sacred act, a bridge connecting her to something divine and timeless. In the daylight, her tiny workshop, tucked away in Alexandria's old quarter, would fill with a warm kiss of sunlight, the air thick with the comforting sense of aged paper and fresh ink. But her true work began at night. It was then, when the city's clamor subsided and the world outside grew quiet, that she could hear nothing but the slow, rhythmic scrape of her reed pen across the surface of the parchment. One evening her usual supply of ink ran dry. She set out for the antique market near El Manchia, a labyrinth of stalls and hidden treasures. As she navigated the familiar paths, her eyes caught something she had never seen before. A narrow, shadowy alley nestled behind a row of vibrant textile stalls. Drawn by an unseen force, she walked toward it. At its very end stood a small, dimly lit shop, its windows veiled in dust and mystery, bearing no sign to announce its name. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was heavy and still. Shelves, crammed from floor to ceiling, overflowed with glass jars, brittle scrolls, and strange tools that seemed to belong to another century. Behind a worn wooden counter sat an old man, his form nearly lost in the gloom. His eyes were clouded with the mists of great age, yet they held a sharpness that pierced through her, making her feel instantly uneasy. When she finally found her voice and asked for ink, a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. His voice when he spoke was a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. "You don't want any ink?" he said, his gaze fixed on her. He reached slowly beneath the counter, his movements deliberate, and brought out a small, unassuming glass bottle. The liquid inside was a profound black, but as it caught the faint light, it shimmered with an inner, almost living luminescence. "This," he whispered, placing it on the counter between them, "was made the old way, the true way, from ash, salt, and sacrifice." Salma frowned, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. She assumed he was simply a strange old man, indulging in a bit of theatrical flair for a customer. But her gaze was irresistibly drawn back to the bottle. The strange, subtle glimmer of the ink within, the way her own reflection seemed to ripple and distort inside its dark depths, held her captive. Without asking another question, without haggling over a price, she bought it. The old man wrapped the bottle in a piece of rough brown paper, his lips moving as he whispered something she couldn't quite decipher. As she stepped out of the shop, she noticed the bell above the door remained eerily silent. A moment later, a sudden chill prompted her to turn back, to look again at the mysterious alley. It was gone. The row of textile stalls stood solid and unbroken, as if the narrow passage had never existed at all. That night, back in the solitude of her apartment, Salma unwrapped the bottle. As she uncorked it, a peculiar scent filled the air, metallic and faintly sweet, a strange and unsettling perfume of rust and roses. She carefully dipped the nib of her finest reed pen into the viscous liquid and began to write her hand tracing the elegant lines of an old Arabic poem about longing and fate. The ink flowed onto the parchment with a smoothness she had never experienced before. It was like writing with liquid silk. Each stroke, each curve, gleamed with an impossible depth, drying almost instantly into lines of perfect, stark beauty. But when she finished the verse and stepped back to admire her work, she saw something that made her heart stop. The words for a fleeting moment seemed to move. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, like a heat shimmer rising from the paper's surface. She blinked hard, her breath catching in her throat, and leaned closer. The letters were perfectly still, frozen in their dark elegance. It must have been a trick of the light, she told herself, a figment of her tired imagination. The next morning, her elderly neighbor, a kind woman who often chatted with her from the adjoining balcony, stopped by. Her face was etched with a strange curiosity. "The verse you wrote last night," she began, her voice lowered. "It was so beautiful. I heard someone reciting it from your balcony, long after midnight." Salma managed a nervous laugh, dismissing the woman's words. She had been sound asleep well before midnight, but the seed of unease had been planted. That night, curiosity and a creeping dread warred within her. She decided to stay awake. Hiding herself in a dark corner of her room, she watched her writing table, her eyes fixed on the sheet of parchment. The hours ticked by in suffocating silence. Then, at precisely 2:47 a.m., it began, a whisper, a soft, rhythmic sound emanating directly from her writing table. She rose slowly, her body trembling. The parchment on her desk was slick, wet, as if the ink had just been applied. The dark liquid shimmered under the moonlight, slanting through her window, and words were forming on their own. The same verse she had written the night before was appearing, letter by letter, but the final line was different. "And what is written," the new line read, "cannot be unwritten." The sudden, sharp clatter of her pen dropping from her nerveless fingers onto the tiled floor broke the spell. Her gaze darted to the ink bottle. It trembled faintly on the table, and a single, small drop slid slowly down its side, thick, viscous, and the color of dried blood. Over the following days, Salma found she couldn't stop using the ink. It was no longer a choice, not just an urge, it was a physical need, a deep, gnawing craving. Every line she wrote blazed with a beauty that was beyond her own skill, beyond any rational explanation. Her hands moved with an unnatural speed and precision, her mind sharper and more focused than it had ever been. And yet, the nights brought a new, terrifying ritual. Every night, new verses would appear on blank sheets of parchment she had left out, verses she did not write. They began by describing her clothes, her smallest movements, the very fabric of her dreams, all documented in elegant, flowing script. She tried to fight it. She tried to switch back to her normal ink, to break the hold this cursed substance had on her. But the moment she reached for another bottle, her hands would begin to shake violently, an unbearable tremor that only ceased when she picked up the shimmering black bottle again. It felt as if her very veins itched for it, as if the ink itself was calling to her blood. Then the messages began to change. They were no longer poetic musings. They were commands. Write my name. Write what I am owed. Let the walls remember me. Soon after, Salma started hearing things. Faint, scratching sounds from behind her apartment walls at night, as though something was painstakingly tracing symbols into the plaster. Her reflection in the mirror grew subtly darker. When she leaned in close, she could swear she saw faint red veins crawling from the corners of her eyes, like tiny, bloody roots. One evening, consumed by desperation, she resolved to end it. She had to destroy the bottle. Wrapping it tightly in a thick cloth, she carried it down to the stone courtyard of her building. With a cry of despair, she smashed it against the cold, hard ground. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the ink did not spill. It didn't splash or splatter. It oozed out, a thick, living mass, and began to slither across the stone, moving with a horrifying purpose directly toward her feet. Salma screamed and stumbled back, but it was too late. A tendril of the black substance touched her ankle. A burning electric pulse shot through her entire body. She looked down in horror as her skin began to darken where the ink had touched, faint, intricate letters appearing beneath the surface, as if branded there from within. She scrambled back inside, clutching her arm, her mind reeling. When she reached the mirror in her hallway, a choked sob escaped her lips. Her skin was writing. Flowing, elegant Arabic letters were spreading up her arms, across her neck, curling like dark vines toward her face. The same ancient, arcane symbols she had seen in books on ancient tombs. The words were spelling out a name, a title. The scribe of the dead. Neighbors heard her crying for hours that night, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. And then, suddenly, there was only silence. The next morning, her apartment was found empty. The only thing left behind was a single sheet of parchment on her writing desk, the ink upon it still glistening, still wet with a black-red sheen. It read, "I have taken back my words." The police who investigated later found strange, unsettling patterns covering her walls, a disquieting mix of ancient hieroglyphs and masterful calligraphy, drawn not with ink, but with something far darker, something that had been scraped from the walls themselves. The apartment was sealed, a place of local legend and hushed whispers. But residents of the building say that if you walk by that sealed door in the dead of a hot Alexandria night, you can still hear it, the faint, rhythmic sound of a reed pen scratching against parchment, and smell something strange and sweet on the air, like rust and roses. Ink is supposed to capture what we feel, what we imagine, what we create, but some ink doesn't come from this world. Some ink writes us instead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this spooky story, please hit the like button and share it with a friend. Subscribe for more content and check out our other stories. Thanks again for watching and stay tuned for more stories. Goodbye.